Hi everyone, welcome to this week. I apologize about that. I forgot to change that. Alright, so there we go. Pen's being weird. Anyway, this week we're going to learn the ablative agent and present passive infinitive, building on the passive that we learned last week. So I've just kind of reinserted these slides. I'm not going to go over them in too much detail. They're from last week, but it's a good opportunity for you to review them. The important thing to remember is that in the passive, the subject is receiving the action rather than doing the action. What we'll learn this week is that the ablative agent is going to give us the opportunity to include the doer of that passive action if the subject is receiving that action. So again, just going through these things from last week, just to reiterate, these are the personal passive endings. So if you don't know those, make sure you do, right? And they're going to correspond with the subjects, just like the active endings. And you can see those, they're combined with the active, of course, but you can see those subjects there. And here's some general information, and then each conjugation in passive forms. Again, these are from last week, but a good opportunity to look them over again and review them. All right, this is the imperfect, same thing. All right, all of your conjugations. And then finally the future. All right, all of your contents. Okay, so on the left is a book from another textbook, the author's name at the bottom right. All right, so I've done some color coding up here. All right, so at the top of these color codings, right, are sort of the parts of the sentence, right? So subject, right, active verb, and then object. And there's kind of quote-unquote translated things. So the subject is the agent in the sense that it is the doer of the action, and the object, of course, is the recipient of the action. Okay, so in a passive verb, or a passive sentence, I should say down here, note that the recipient, right, becomes the subject. Now the verb is passive as opposed to active, and then the agent, right, kind of comes afterwards, and it's in parentheses because the agent is optional in a passive sentence. All right, and then you get an example down here. These are arrows that don't translate into this program from PowerPoint. So she hit the ball was hit by her. He saw his friend was seen by him. And again, if you sort of match up the colors, the yellow is the agent, right? So it's active here, and of course it's the subject, and it's passive here, and it's the ablative of agent. And we'll talk about that in Latin in a sec. All right, but again, the subject, or I should say the agent, in yellow, so she in the active sentence, and by her in the passive sentence, he in the active sentence, and by him in the passive sentence. All right, then in green, of course, are the verbs. In the active column, of course, the verbs are active, so she hit, he saw, and then in the passive sentence, the verbs are, of course, passive, so was hit and was seen. And then the blue, of course, the recipient of the action. All right, so in the active sentence, that of course is the direct object. She hit the ball, he saw his friend, the ball is being hit, the friend is being seen. And then in the passive sentence, the recipient of the action, of course, becomes the subject. So the ball was hit, his friend was seen. And again, note that the agent is going to be optional. So I can say as a full sentence, the ball was hit. I can say as a full sentence, his friend was seen. If I want to add an agent in a doer, then I can add in that optional ablative of agent. All right, so you can look over the sheet on the left, but in Latin, all right, the ablative agent needs three things. So it, of course, needs a passive verb. You cannot have an ablative agent without a passive verb. All right, it needs the Latin preposition a or ab. This in English is going to be by. And then it needs a person. All right, so the agent, the ablative agent, has to be a person. It cannot be a thing. If it's a thing, it's going to be an ablative of means and is going to not use a preposition and just be in the ablative. Okay, so for it to be an agent, an ablative agent, it needs to be a person. All right, so in other words, in the first sentence, the first example, she hit the ball. The passive sentence, the ball was hit by her, that's an ablative of agent in Latin because you have your three things. You have your passive verb, it's going to use a or ab, and of course her is a person. If you say the ball was hit by the bat, That is not an ablative agent because, of course, bat is a thing rather than a person. That's going to be an ablative of means, which again is just ablative with no preposition. So a somewhat important distinction to make, but that's really only for when you're going English to Latin. All right, so 3 requirements for an ablative agent: passive verb, ob, and the agent being a person. Okay, so speaking of which, here is another, or a little exercise kind of practicing that. And again, this is just English. So you've got an underlined phrase. Your job is to identify whether the agent is a subject, an ablative of agent, or a means, which is technically not an agent. All right, so in other words, in the first one, the tree was hugged by Apollo. Well, we have a passive verb. All right, we have a person. And we have that by, sort of the equivalent of our ob in English. All right, so that makes that an ablative of agent. All right, in the second one, we have the same thing, passive verb, by, but now we have a thing as opposed to a person. So it can't be an ablative of agent, so it's an ablative of means, because it's doing the same thing, but it's, of course, a thing. All right, and then number 7, all right, obviously it's the left of the verb, and that verb rode is active, so that's just going to make it a subject. All right, as we've been doing, you can do the rest, and then the next slide will be the answers. All right, there we go. All right, I suppose I did some of those myself. Sorry about that. All right, shifting gears a little bit. The other thing we're learning this week is the present passive infinitive. All right, we know the active infinitive, and that is on the left here. So those are all the active infinitives that we're familiar with, and these are, generally speaking, the second principal parts of the verb. The second principal part will end in that RE for regular verbs, and then you'll have some irregular infinitives as well. So your basic formation for the present, your basic formation for the present passive infinitive is, rather than an RE, you're going to have an RI. So RE, RI, RE. Oh, sorry, we'll come back to that one. RE and RI. Okay. The characteristic vowels, the vowels that come before the R, stay the same. Now you might notice that for third and third IO, it's going to be a little different in that the whole ERE is going to change just to an I. All right, so ponere is going to become poni, not poneri, as we would expect from the other verbs. Capere is going to become capi, not as we would expect caperi from the like the other verbs. So it's a relatively easy rule to remember. It's a relatively difficult form to recognize, mostly because that I on a verb is more commonly associated with the third principal part, that perfect active indicative, first person singular. It's a much more commonly used form than the present passive infinitive, and so you have to watch out for it. The big clue that you're dealing with in an infinitive is that you will generally have some verb that takes an infinitive. So potest, right, wolt, something like that. Those verbs like be able to, want to, that will sort of set up an infinitive. So that's kind of your big clue, is not sort of the form itself, but there being another verb that's going to take an infinitive, hopefully then generating that question of, where's my infinitive? Oh, that must be a present passive infinitive. The first, second, and fourth conjugation passive infinitives are relatively easy to recognize, as I said, because of that R and the characteristic vowel. It's that third and third IO with just the I ending and be tricky to recognize. All right, and here's another page from that other textbook. Does a nice job of sort of organizing things. Just gives you the same information in a slightly different form, so if that's easier for you to work through. All right, and there it is. All right, here are some present passive infinitives in action. All right, so there's conspici. That is a third IO infinitive, conspicio, conspicere, and that is the present passive infinitive, conspici. Prodesse is the verb to be, a compound of the verb to be. So that is a clue that you're dealing with an infinitive. So prodesse, to be useful, quam, rather than, conspici, to be viewed, to be seen, to be beheld, right? So rather than sort of being public about things, just sort of do things behind the scenes that are useful and helpful. So to be useful rather than to be seen. All right, and this is Miami University in Ohio. All right, so this is a relatively common one. Esse quam videri. This is the motto of North Carolina, among others. So to be, esse, rather than to be seen or to seem, Remember that video in the passive can mean to be seen, it's true passive, or to seem with an M. But there is that second conjugation passive infinitive. So video, videre, is the first two principal parts, and there is that eri, which is the present passive infinitive. All right, and I forget which one this is. Apologies, but here are two. Let me get a better color. Here are two passive infinitives. These are third IO passive infinitives, but they are deponents. So progredior and regredior, and then progredi and regredi are the second principal parts. All right, so to not move forward is to move backward. So to not progress is to regress. All right, but those are those passive infinitives. They are translated actively because, as I said, the verbs are. All right, so here are some exercises. So you're just identifying the verbs as active or passive and translating the forms. All right, so if I go down here to constitui, all right, with just that I, that is passive. To be decided. Oh, and just to make sure, I'm not sure I said it explicitly. So the active infinitive is to verb. All right, and the passive infinitive is to be verbed. As is often the case with passive, you're combining that past participle with some form of the verb to be. All right, and then number 12 over here with that eri is active, and that's going to be to drag. All right, here are answers. All right, look at that. I answered ones that I did not answer here. So there we go. You got some reference there. All right, so now we're identifying them as an indicative or infinitive in translating, and this is getting at that third principal part confusion with the present passive infinitive. Some of these you're going to have to look up principal parts for. So for instance, if you look at number 4, this is pono, ponera, posui is the third principal part. All right, so it is indicative. All right, and I placed or I put. All right, versus mitti, which is mitto, mittere, and that is an infinitive, and that is going to be to be sent. All right, and you can practice on the rest. And here come the answers. All right, and here are this week's summatives. All right, so a reading for the reading summative. So prae is about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, all right, in 79. So prae per multos dies tremor terrae, illa vero nocte invaluit, et non solum movere omnia sed etiam verti credebantur. So again, we read through the Latin to make sure that we can kind of make some notes, like that T ending, and that is a nominative, so those are going to go together. So some kind of tremor of the earth, some sort of shaking of the earth had happened for many days. Per multos dies, right? So tremor terrae, some sort of tremor of the earth, had happened for many days. All right. Illa vero nocte invaluit. Be careful of these first word non-nominatives. You can see that A is long, so that's actually going to agree with nocte. Okay, indeed, where that night. All right. The tremor invaluit sort of was weaker. And not only, so credebantur, this verb here, is going to be in charge of that infinitive movere and that infinitive verti. All right, so, indeed that night, somebody was asleep. I gotta check that word. Apologies. All right, and, all right, everything was believed. Note that passive there. Everything was believed not only to be moved, but also to be sort of turned over. So it was seen. So everything was sort of in chaos. Everything was going all over the place. This is sort of the earthquake or the shaking of the earth from the eruption. So erupit cubiculum meum mater, iam surrexi et sedimus in area domus, quae inter mare et tectum erat. So Mom burst into my room, my bedroom. All right, so Mom burst into my room. All right, I then got up, and we sat in the area of the house which was between the sea and kind of the roof of the house itself. All right, and I will let you do the rest. All right, in writing, we're just going English to Latin. All right, so these are the two consuls who were being elected by the Romans. All right. So these, hikaikak, so he, duo, consules sunt, qui Romanis electebantur. All right. So these are the two consuls who were being elected by the Romans, and that Romanis, that's that ablative agent that we learned at the beginning, right, as part of the chapter. So there's my passive verb, there's my ab, and there's my person in the ablative. That's the object of or ab. All right, along those lines, we skip to number 5. So literae ad uxorem mitti debent. Where's that? There we go. Okay, so a letter, literae, all right, ought to be sent to my wife. All right, so literae is, of course, the subject of debent, but mitti, to be sent, that's that passive infinitive, and it is a third conjugation verb, so it's just the I instead of any kind of RI or ERI. And then to my wife is just a prepositional phrase. All right, so that's going to do it for this week. I'll be back next week, and please email if you have any questions. Thanks.